Dueling was awesome, and we should bring it back. That is the subject of today's talk, which is a companion piece to the audiobook that I just released, Dueling Stories of the 16th Century. Took me several months overall to iron that out, but it's right there and it's available on the channel if you want to listen to it. It's over 6 hours. It has tons of stories of duels, and it was even one of the major sources, because it was written in the 1600s, of another book that I read on the history of dueling. So awesome book if you want to check that out. Otherwise, can we bring back dueling in modern society? This is going to be quick. I'm going to run through it as quick as I possibly can and just focus on my notes here and get the information out, because there's a lot of things to cover here. Dueling is actually a pretty complex topic, and considering dueling in more ancient or medieval times versus how that would look in modernity, I'm going to give just a very rough overview. So I'm Michael from Memory Medieval, and shortly I'm putting together my flagship podcast, the first episode will be on Roger the First of Sicily. And this presentation didn't really go where I thought it was going to go, kind of a surprise ending. So hope you enjoy that. And let's get into it. So obviously I just mentioned the audiobook, and I also read The Duel, A History by Robert Baldick, and I read the review from the Worthy House on Gentleman's Blood, which sounds like it was very similar to The Duel, A History by Robert Baldick. And they say if you read 3 books, then you're already more knowledgeable than 99% of the population. So I think 2 books and a book review probably puts me maybe over 70%. What do you think? You can let me know. And feel free to let me know what you think in the comments, because this is like I said, it's a very complex topic and there's a lot of things going on. So here's a quick review of what we're going to discuss: the types of duels, reasons dueling worked in society at that time, reasons why dueling declined and ended, pros and cons, the challenges of dueling in modernity, mutual combat, and can there be honor or meaning in modernity? Quick disclaimer: this is a conversation for adults. Everything has trade-offs. I'm not arguing for utopia. I'm not saying if we brought back dueling, everything would be perfect. There are shortfalls to dueling, which are obvious. Too much dueling leads to excessive deaths. There are shortfalls to not dueling. Not dueling leads to people just saying whatever they want and doing whatever they want with significantly less repercussions. So you can disagree, but the disagreement is mostly about trade-offs in that case. So like in that context, feel free to let me know what you think about the various trade-offs. But I just want to cut everybody off at the knees who wants to comment about, you think society would be perfect? Just don't worry about that, because I obviously don't. So there are 4 main types of duels. And there is the judicial duel, which was the first type of duel, which began actually sometime around the year 500, it is alleged, in Burgundy. And the judicial duel is as it sounds. There are various contentious matters of judicial head where one party alleges something, another party alleges that it didn't happen, it's unresolved, and therefore a duel is proposed as the result. So that started way back in the year roughly 500, at least as far as Robert could tell, as far as records go, that we have some, at least, and that's as far as it being somewhat integrated into society. That's not to say that it didn't ever happen before, and he makes the case that there are people who want to argue that gladiators were duelists or this type of thing. But that's the basic of it. The chivalric duel is sort of in between the judicial duel and the point of honor, where it is something that involves some kind of context of honor, but it also is typically something that had a judicial aspect to it, something that maybe was some sort of blend of the two. And that obviously happened a lot more in the age of chivalry. Then there is more strictly just the point of honor duel, which is probably the most famous type in the 1600s, 1700s. You bump into somebody, watch where you're going. No, you watch where you're going. Now we have to fight tomorrow at dawn or tonight at the quay or wherever it may be. And the backwoods duel, also known as the duel alla mazza or duello alla mazza. And that's what I just described, sort of the point of honor thing, but out in the woods. The important point to note here is that within judicial, chivalric, or even a point of honor duel, there was very strict formalities and manners and a strict guideline that governed those things. So actually the point of honor where I just mentioned, we're going to fight out in the woods or whatever, that's the duel alla mazza. The point of honor would be, oh, well, I send you a formal challenge. You formally respond. There is a formal time and place. There are formal lists within which that you fight. That would be the official point of honor duel. And then the backwoods duel would be sort of, you offended me. Let's go fight. So that's the big distinction, though, is that the first three, judicial, chivalric, and point of honor, all have a certain strict formality, whereas the backwoods duel is just let's go fight in the woods to the death, and whatever happens, happens. So a few reasons why dueling worked in that society of the time from 500 to, let's say, really about the 1760s was when it started to really taper off. Most duelists were elites of some level. So dueling was not really fueled by the candlestick maker and the baker having a feud or a conflict and then getting their swords and fighting in the street. Duelists, for the most part, were trained warriors, trained soldiers. They were professional fighters. Their job was to kill people. So killing people in a duel was not all that far off from going to war and killing people in war. So it wasn't a big stretch. It wasn't like today, if you had, we'll get into it. Most duelists were elite. The sovereigns at the time didn't really persecute or enforce any measures against dueling very strongly. So there were various measures that were attempted at various times to curb dueling or to stop dueling, but the kings themselves, for the most part, or the sovereigns, weren't really against it that much and gave a lot of, I forget what the word is, exceptions. They gave a lot of exceptions for dueling. They didn't really punish people very harshly. That's not to say nobody got punished, but it was more of a something egregious would have to happen where there was a lot of court pressure in order for them to do something. Otherwise, they made the edict because of pressure or whatever, and then sort of turned a blind eye. As mentioned, the elites were warriors at the time, so dueling was simply an extension of their normal lives. Elites lived within a culture that placed a high premium on honor. In one thing that Robert mentions in his book is that at particular times, historians wrote that the worst offense that you could do to somebody was to give them the lie, was to lie to somebody. So society at the time placed a high premium on being honest, on speaking plainly, on telling the truth. And so not telling the truth, an extension of that was then you were met with violence. The justice system was obviously fairly simple at that time. The sovereign was sort of the main enforcer, whether that's the king or a duke or possibly even a count, the general of an army in the case of soldiers or captains fighting or whomever. So the justice system or method of enforcement was much simpler, and there was obviously no insurance, which means that there was a very high risk, obviously, if you're risking your life. But as mentioned, these were warriors and soldiers, for the most part, who risked their lives going to war or to protect their property or land or vassals. And so risking your life in some way was I'm not going to say it was nothing. It was obviously, they cared about living, but it was not something that was uncommon, unlike today, where if you think about, like, if I was to get into a duel, it would be, the most extreme thing that I've ever done, because I've obviously never, I wasn't in the military, and so I've never fought anybody to death. So that would be an extreme measure for me. But you can think about that as if the candlestick maker was going to do a duel, fight a duel back in the day. It'd be the same type of thing for him. So that's not something that would have been commonplace for people who are not trained soldiers and fighters. And so the risk was much more accepted, much more commonplace. So, some reasons why dueling declined and ended. Well, the Catholic Church put out a pretty harsh ban at the Council of Trent in 1563. They also tried to put out some other measures to limit dueling. One, I believe, was in about 1143, where they said that dueling could not take place Monday through Wednesday, to sort of, I guess, jam it into the weekend, make the weekends eventful or something. I'm not exactly sure what the point of that is. Sort of reminds me of like banning the purchase of alcohol on Sundays. Like, okay, well, everybody just needs to buy alcohol Monday through Saturday then. But they made various attempts like that to ban dueling, and then it was officially banned at the Council of Trent in 1563. The other issue with dueling is that weapons evolved past swords or handheld arms into guns. Now, this was not just with dueling, but also on the battlefield. The evolution of the gun and the cannon and various gunpowder, projectile weapons sort of removed the prowess and expertise of the hand-to-hand warrior from significance on the battlefield. And so the 15th and 16th and 17th century were transitional periods where that skill set was being removed from battle and therefore less common in warriors or soldiers, which also led to a decline in the power and influence of warrior elites. Because if war is becoming more mechanized and less reliant on the warrior, then the warrior is going to have a less prominent place in society. So the decline, I'm not saying, to be clear, I'm not saying that the decline of the duel led to the decline of the warrior elite, or that the decline of the warrior elite led to the decline of the duel, but they certainly seemed to track pretty similarly to where by the time we start getting into the 1800s and certainly by the 1900s, the power and influence of warrior elites is basically gone, and dueling is basically over as well. I also want to mention, this says negative public sentiment, question mark. It's because in the history of dueling, the second book that I read, Robert seems to think that what really caused dueling to decline was negative public sentiment. I just want to point that out. And there were particular duels that caused wild negative public sentiment, such as the Yarnack-Chastain-Array duel, 1527, I believe, and also the Alexander Hamilton-Aaron Burr duel caused massive negative public sentiment. It's even said that even though Alexander Hamilton died, Aaron Burr, who survived, got the worst of the duel because he basically lived in declining. He went from being the vice president to living in basically declining obscurity and poverty due to the massive negative public backlash. So there were instances of negative public sentiment that affected people's perception of the duel, but I think that the real driver of the duel was through the elite classes. And the elite classes were warriors, and dueling was an extension of warrior society. So if there was, Chastain-Array and Yarnak. That duel had huge public negative sentiment because Chastainere was immensely popular, probably one of the most popular men in France at the time when he was killed in the duel by Yarnak. And dueling went on. It even peaked well after that. But that was because the elite classes were still very much warriors, very much interested in upholding honor and various other things that they were fighting for. So, some pros and cons of dueling. Dueling allows for an open establishment of social hierarchy. This is sort of one of the main functions of dueling, is that it allows for that establishment of hierarchy. For example, if you were a soldier, you can't challenge the king because, that's like too far of a hierarchy. But if you had an issue with your direct captain, maybe that would be an issue to hash out. Or if you were simply a count and somebody else was a count, or, you're some sort of gentleman knight on equal footing, then if there's a disagreement, you can exchange challenges, meet for the formal duel, and establish the decisive result of that problem, if you will, which establishes some sort of social hierarchy. It does allow for open dispute or conflict. One thing that is sort of not really taken into consideration is that in early medieval societies, assassinations and poisonings and things of that nature were not really in the repertoire of rulers at the time. And part of that was because rulers at the time had very straightforward ways of settling their problems. If there was any sort of dispute, you could settle it like this. You didn't need to assassinate somebody. And assassination was looked upon, and I think still is, as dirty, underhanded, evil. It's not a good thing. And so the duel allows you it allows you a venue for publicly and opening settling a dispute. Also, the duel, even if nobody dies, is a way of settling the dispute definitively. Very few duels, even duels where nobody died, were not settled definitively, where either the sides were reconciled or the point on whatever end or the case or matter was conceded. So the duel allows for a very definitive resolution. The other great thing I think about the duel is that it doesn't place all of the burden of social peace or cohesion on the sovereign. It's not necessarily just the king's responsibility to be enforcing the rules or etiquette or decorum or the social hierarchy or whatever. It allows for the minor sovereigns or minor nobles or, those down the chain to be enforcing some sort of social peace or cohesion on their own. The cons of dueling are that, of course, in dueling, there can become, when you have a society that is dueling, there can become too much dueling or dueling over frivolous things. You end up with these sort of quarrelsome men who become professional duelists and antagonize people in order to, go fight them for sport. There was even various assassins who, they would get contracted out to assassinate somebody and do it by challenging them to a duel. So there are definitely dark sides to that, which need to be mitigated. Because those things I certainly don't agree with or think they are great. And I also put increased violence in society. I don't know. In Brantôme's time, he argues that the duel was actually a mitigator against violence in society, but that was when they had a lot of armed gangs and assassinations running around and all sorts of things like that. So his perspective was that the formality of the duel allowed for everything to be much more limited and in the open as opposed to these dirty assassinations and street fights and ambushes and things like that. So that's kind of a general pros and cons. So it should be pretty obvious. I view dueling as a net positive on medieval and early modern society. And Um, and in addition, it allowed men with martial skills to maintain some sort of control over social discourse because if things ever came to a head, then you could hash it out in the lists. It created some sort of modifying or tempering effect on the manners and behaviors and the way that people spoke to each other because you obviously wouldn't just say whatever you wanted if you knew that somebody was ready to defend some counter opinion uh, in the lists. So let's talk about some challenges for dueling in modernity. How many elites today are willing to fight for anything? Our elites today are merchants. They are CEOs, lawyers, and bureaucrats. And if we're just being honest, they're mostly weak and pathetic. So the merchant elite, dueling is not a sort of tangential out. I don't know exactly how you would say it, an accoutrement to being a merchant. So dueling is something that would be very foreign to merchants today for the most part. Our culture now places no real premium on honor, respectability, or honesty, which, of course, for the point of honor debate or even the chivalric debates, chivalric duel, sorry, point of honor duel or chivalric duel, obviously those a lot in large part were based on honor, respectability, or honesty, giving somebody the lie, saying something false, disagreeing with somebody so harshly, or they wrong you in some way that you need satisfaction. Our justice system today is obviously more complex, it's more bureaucratic, and so its methods of enforcement and prosecution are both stricter and more arbitrary. Big insurance is a big driver in human behavior. So, how you want to translate how insurance works into dueling, that could be a whole. I'd need to talk to somebody who's an insurance somebody and see how that would work more because I'm no expert on insurance, but I do know that insurance through the premiums that they charge and what they're willing to insure, how much risk they're willing to take on, it does drive what behaviors are generally allowed. Think about offing yourself, for example. That wouldn't be covered by life insurance. And so you don't have a lot of people who are eager to off themselves if they have a family that is depending on them and even if they have life insurance, because that would be nulled and voided by your policy. So big insurance in that way is something of a driver in human behavior. Now, women hold elite positions in society. How are you going to have duels with other elites if the other elite is a woman? They actually had a solution for this in medieval times. If there was a serious dispute between a husband and wife, they would have a duel, sometimes to the death, and the man would be handicapped. So he would be maybe buried in a hole up to his waist with one hand tied behind his back. And then, the woman is free to run around and try to, poke him or stab him or hit him with an axe or whatever her weapon is as he's buried in the hole with his arm tied behind his back. So they had ways of sort of dealing with that in medieval society, but I don't know if I have a hard time seeing some sort of dueling with elites meshing with our female elites today. It's obviously banned now by the Catholic Church, and also weapons are very advanced. So, and this one is a little bit more interesting. Can you have a duel with drones? You could have people holding the drone and they fly the drone and try to go kill the other person who's flying the drone. Obviously, shooting weapons are very much more advanced now than they were at the time of even pistols. And so handheld weapons are not really an extension of anything that anybody does anymore. Nobody regularly uses 12-inch daggers or carries side swords or is used to going to war with pole arms or two-handed swords or anything like that. So any of the handheld weapons are very they're very removed from our experience today. Uh, my personal opinion is that guns don't provide a very, uh, I guess I'm not exactly sure how to say it, like a very good resolution to a duel. And then obviously, the more technology, the further away you get, it sort of, becomes more of like a game of manipulating technology. There's one example of a duel in the book, Dueling Stories from the 16th Century, where he talks about how one of the duelists, when selecting the weapons, selected, I forget what the name for it is, but it's the crossbow that hooks to your belt and has the crank, and you put a bolt in it and you got to crank it and all of this stuff. And that was very famous in Gascony. And this was a Gascon who was challenging an Italian. And so he made the case that it was actually a common weapon in Gascony. And in fact, Gascony is well known for being experts at this weapon, which people accepted. And he was, of course, able to put his bolt in, once they established and it was like, okay, ready, go. He was able to put his bolt in and wind it up and shoot the other guy twice before the other guy had even wound up his one time. So once you start getting into extreme technology like that, it becomes much more about your proficiency with the technology, which isn't to say that with swords, it's not about your proficiency with the swords, but your strength and your abilities and sort of your general physical fitness obviously plays a much bigger part in that respect. So it's a much more man-on-man affair from that point of view. So weapons today are very advanced. I'm not exactly sure how exactly you go about that. So it's probably safe to say that dueling is not returning anytime soon. However, this was recently posted by a ex-friend of mine. That's X, the social platform. That is Adam Rossi. More states should join Texas and Washington in legalizing mutual combat. No legal consequences if two adults both consent to fight, must not be impaired or intoxicated, and must not injure or imperil surrounding property or bystanders. And so you can see the map there of states that have some sort of mutual combat exception. And this is from the Wikipedia. And you can see there a notable example is in 2012, MMA fighter Ben Fodor. He engaged in mutual combat on the streets of Seattle. And that's why I'm wearing this shirt today, because back in the day, I did meet Phoenix Jones. I did meet him. And I was wearing this exact same shirt, as you can see. I used to wear this shirt when I would go run the stairs at the end of Capitol Hill. There's a huge stairway with like 300 stairs, and I would run stairs at night. And then I was in the QFC at the corner of Broadway and Pine. And Good Morning America was running through and interviewing him and filming this. So if you want to go watch it, you can go check it out. That's Ben Fodor, Phoenix Jones. And let's click and watch his fight so you can see it. So this was, let's see. So I'm just going to skip to the relevant parts here. So this was sensational at the time that it happened. So you'll see he's right here on the right side of the screen. You can see his yellow sleeves, and he's going to fight the guy in the orange who's taking off his jacket. And you're going to see here the police. I should have it at about the time that the police roll up here. And he's going to walk up and talk to the police, because the police are obviously trying to see what's going on. There's a huge crowd. I believe this was on Broadway. And so he's going to talk to the police, make sure everything's good. They're going to have a few conversations. Guy in the orange is just talking all kinds of trash. I think he's actually drunk, so this maybe falls outside of the bounds of that. But there was no charges pressed. And let's skip ahead here. What Guy in the orange doesn't know is that he is a trained MMA fighter. Everybody discovered that at this point. once this video came out, then everybody realized he wasn't just a guy in a costume. He was actually a minor MMA fighter. So he's like, all right, let's fight. And the guy says, okay, let's fight. So I believe they just shook hands there. This guy picked it up. Then he's like, all right, let's fight. So you'll see the other guy is totally out of his element. Things are going very poorly for him. Phoenix Jones is starting to really slow him down. And then he's going to finish him off here in a second. And that's the end of it. So we did come close to a little bit of emergence of this with Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg allegedly going to hash out some differences by having an MMA match. There was a lot of talk, a lot of trying to schedule something, figure things out. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. But it was at this point when I was putting together the presentation that I was like, wait a minute, there's a few other things that I have been seeing around, such as Conor McGregor saying that he's going to run for president of Ireland. So maybe mutual combat can make a comeback. Maybe there can be some sort of mutual combat angle that brings back some sort of honor society martial class within Western civilization. To be clear, let's talk about mutual combat for a minute. Making mutual combat legal is probably a net positive. And keep in mind that exists within a legal framework. It would have to be agreed by both parties, no damaging property, et cetera, et cetera. So there would be a formality around which you would fight somebody. And of course, there would be rules around when somebody gave up. So like if you're in the duel and you give up, you surrender, but then somebody keeps going and they keep going and you're yelling that you surrender and they keep going and they kill you, that would obviously, within the context of mutual combat, be murder. So just to be clear, mutual combat is an agreed upon allowance for the physical resolution of disputes, but within that framework, the allowance for parties to withdraw, surrender, and so forth. So I think that's good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it would be it would necessarily take off, because in order to have people fighting in that way or resolving things in society in that way, you also need to have something honorable in society to fight for, really. Otherwise, you're just going to get sort of a bunch of, I mean, maybe not drunk guys if that's also prohibited, but a bunch of troublemakers fighting each other or whatever. There needs to be some sort of elite function in society that also drives that change in opinion from the top down. So Conor McGregor becoming president of Ireland, and then if he were to institute some sort of mutual combat in Ireland, and then MMA fighting maybe becomes even more accepted and something that younger men start doing, and then that becomes, starts to permeate society a little bit more, then maybe MMA fighters could get involved in society in such a way as to become an elite class that then brings back some sort of honor/warrior culture in Western society. And it wouldn't be a duel to the degree that we think of duels with swords or daggers or axes or whatnot, even pistols. But it may be a duel such as, a mutual combat fight that is maybe a little bit more official. because you can see here there's been lots of talk from these guys. Sean Strickland, he says, probably will run for some political office. Obviously, Conor McGregor. Chael Sonnen says he plans to run for governor of Oregon. And there's many others of these UFC or fighting stars who are now saying that they're going to be getting political. So, I didn't see this coming, but maybe it is something where MMA fighters can bring something back. I don't know. Can they? It's an interesting thing to think about, I suppose, if that's possible. You can let me know in the comments what you think about that, because that's really where I've gone with that. I don't see a real straightforward way to bring dueling back into society with all of the other factors, merchant elites, insurance. There's a lot of factors. We need some sort of warrior elite class, some sort of martial class. Whoops, not that. We need some sort of martial class to take over and to make it work. They're going to have to sort of forge the way or push the way, because there's not really a way. It's not going to emerge spontaneously. The bureaucracy by the merchant elite is just churning away to make the most money. How can they make the most money? How can they take care of the bottom line? How can everything be profitable? And so, there's not going to be any honor culture or settling differences with duels or even fights that assume any amount of risk in that sort of culture. There would need to be some sort of culture emerging that values other things. So that's my take on it. Let me know what you think in the comments. You can let me know what angle I may be missing. You can see, I went as fast as I could, 37 minutes. It's a huge topic. Even just the topic of dueling is a huge topic, and trying to then contextualize that into modern society or what that might look like is pretty difficult. So let me know what you think. And a reminder, check out the audiobook, Dueling Stories of the 16th Century, if you'd like to read about the manners, customs, formalities, and the conflicts of the elites of that time and prior.